Hello, everyone. My name is Emilia, and I am a student at the USF Architecture School at the School of Architecture and Community Design, and I am getting my master's in urban and community design. So this semester in our class, we were looking at the area of Old West Tampa and studying the possibilities of how to revitalize and how to improve this area through different the improvement of different urban conditions through the use of the streets and blocks and basically the urban realm. So when we first visited West Tampa, what stood out to me was its amazing character and all it had to offer, the quality of the spaces, the existing restaurants, the diverse community. But some of the other things that stood out to me were how deserted it seemed and how the infrastructure wasn't as good as it could be, or it was deteriorated, or it didn't really seem to me as if it was getting the attention it deserved. Old Tampa has a lot of character. It has an amazing population that is diverse, that is mixed, and that has so much to offer. And that's why we thought that revitalizing this area and looking at the conditions and how to improve it would be very beneficial to the community and to those visiting. So many cities in the United States are thinking about how to revitalize their cities through the streets and through the blocks. These are incredibly important elements of a community because it's how people get to their jobs, it's how they get commerce, is where they live, is where they have activities. And by improving these, in turn, there's a healthier lifestyle. People are more likely to have a walkable lifestyle, to have access to absolutely all their needs. Kids can go to their school, parents can go to their jobs, and so it's really important to focus on this. So we went through a process where we started with a great amount of research at both reading, looking at the CRA existing plan, looking at the proposals, but also visiting the site and getting to know the people of West Tampa, which was even more valuable to me. So when we're designing at eye level, it means that we're designing at the same way that we would occupy it. Usually when we talk about urban design, people tend to think that is people designing at 500 feet above ground. And so it's easy to look at things and to really lose that human connection that we have when we're looking at the street from eye level. So what we did is we walked through the streets and looked at different elements, such as walkability, the use of the existing buildings, and the relationships between different elements within. Overall, my first impression of Tampa, as I said, is that it has so much potential, that the streets are already great in terms of the mix of uses, the diversity of the population, the types of businesses, the fact that there's residential integrated within commerce, and all of these things have so much potential that with a little bit of improvement could be incredible. Here are a few images of things that are both positive and negative. On one hand, you have businesses and the human scale with shading for people to walk. You have the character of the many old historic buildings. You have availability for green spaces, but also some lots that are empty and deserted. In terms of mobility, West Tampa has a lot to offer and a lot to be improved as well. When we look at the principles of walkability, some things that can guide us are a reason to walk, which West Tampa has to offer. There's businesses, there's public services, there's retail. A safe walk, which is something that maybe is not the case. It's a little bit, the infrastructure isn't great. There's this perceived notion of unsafety that is something that bothers the community and something that we can work on. The next one is a comfortable walk, which through shading, large spaces, and there's cases where this is great, like in this example, there's shading, there's a wide space for people to walk, and there's other examples where it's not as successful. And an interesting walk, which again, West Tampa is one of the most charming places in the Tampa Bay area, and it has a lot to offer. Even places like this, which is an alleyway between two buildings, it could be read as maybe an unsafe portion of the street, but also it could be used with so much potential to create one of those smaller street rooms. So the different building types, there's a lot of historic buildings, so many cigar factories, and there's also a few contemporary buildings, which have a variety of mix of uses, like I mentioned before. there's retail, there's housing, and then there's these really powerful paths and places throughout that could be exploited in order to create better places. However, in terms of infrastructure and the way that people have dealt with their surroundings has a negative effect on the look of the street and the look of the area. Similarly, there's, in terms of walkability and in terms of the street room, there's the different relationships that we can see there. For example, the pedestrian versus the vehicles, and how cars are prioritized over pedestrians, providing so much room for them to drive, and people are speeding while the pedestrians have to struggle to walk on the sidewalk. And then the last aspect is that the locals have this beautiful sense of pride for the community. They've been here for many, many years, and so they love the community. And I think it's something that is important to share with visitors and to get people to come and visit, and at the same time ensure that the locals remain there and that they can keep that sense of pride and that they can profit and share the wonders that they have in West Tampa, such as the human scale, the character, the availability for nature and recreation, and the wonderful public spaces that are already in place. So through this, we started creating documentations of the different conflicts, connections, strengths, and weaknesses. And for instance, this, looking at it in perspective, looking at how the facades could be reevaluated and how they don't have to be these hard, unwelcoming facades, but rather a storefront like this one. How there's an issue with parking. There's a lot of empty parking lots or just lots, but there's not enough on-street parking in some senses, or maybe it could just be more efficient. Not a lot of light, and the placemaking is not as developed as it could be. Then we went into a little bit more of data collection in terms of research, and we started creating these plans where we overlaid different elements to see their relationships and to look at places for improvement. So for instance, this one looks at connectivity. So looking at the bus routes, at the bus stops. When we were talking to the community last week, people mentioned that the bus routes aren't efficient and they aren't taking them where they need to go. So this is something that we considered when we reevaluated how this could be addressed. Similarly, the space in between, there's so much space, and here in the image, when we see the building footprint, there's so much space in between, so it's maybe not being used to its biggest potential. Same, we see these alleyways and how they're connecting, and they could be secondary means for people to walk throughout and to integrate those blocks a little bit better. The use of the historic structures, which are amazing, but they are disregarded to a certain extent. The types of trees, Tampa being one of the cities with the highest tree canopy, this is something that could be improved, and that when we see, for example, the build outs that were built for the Super Bowl on Howard Street, these aren't really sustaining the trees, and so they're planting and now they're dying. So just how to address this and improve it and bring back to life this wonderful tree canopy that's already there and available. And finally, this map looks at those principles of walkability in relationship to the building use, with this circle here delineating a quarter-mile radius, which is what usually people are willing to walk. So there's so much within this area that people somebody who lives here should be able to walk to all these places with that interesting, safe, purposeful walk and access all of their needs. The last element of this research was looking at what people wanted and talking to people. And a lot of this information in my case came from the CRA document that was created. And those top priorities were economic development, infrastructure improvements, public space, and historic preservation, as well as the needs and what people want. So for instance, one of the big issues are the transportation, the site deterioration, the high incidence of crime. So these were all things that we were taking into consideration when we moved on to creating our own frameworks of how to develop the area. So we also looked at the existing conditions in terms of the zones that are there. I specifically focused closely on one of the blocks and looking at the ratio of hard surface versus green and how the greenery is not really used to its best advantage. However, in section, it is quite a successful street due to the close relationship between the buildings and that human scale. And with all of this information, we started guiding and creating a vision and a framework, and we guided ourselves with 10 main principles. And all of these principles relate to one another, then they're closely connected. However, we started prioritizing them in order to see what would be the first call to action, and then how these would start to relate to each other. So for example, for me, social participation was key for the development of the community, because first and foremost, we should know what the community wants, and they should be involved in the design in order to gain that sense of trust and that sense of pride in whatever it is, whatever's done. Second is improving the local economy and assuring that the people who live there can have their businesses and can sustain their lives there, as well as continue to grow, continue to bring income to the community, but without losing that local identity, which for me was the third priority, and maintaining that character, maintaining the positivity in people, and not allowing gentrification and big businesses to come in and take the people who make West Tampa out. And finally, diversity of uses, which is also continuing to have that integration of all these mixed uses so that people can stay. These are the other 4 principles that, light, human scale. And for me, these weren't at the top because it was something that was already there, but granted, they can still be developed and worked on. For instance, improving lighting, which will bring safety and will bring life to the green areas and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own project. And what I decided to do is to focus in on one single block and try to develop it a little more than looking at the whole area, and taking it as a catalyst and a case study of what could be done throughout the whole CRA development. And so I picked this block in the intersection of Howard and Main Street, and I did it because it is an incredible location in terms of its proximity to businesses, to the post office, to the library. It has ample green spaces. It has just so much potential. And we talked to the people who own one of these lots, and they are extremely willing to do whatever is possible in order to make this a catalyst and to provide additional parking necessary or provide spaces for businesses and so on. So again, and I'm going to talk about those first 4 principles that I already mentioned. And number 1 was the social participation. So I went back to those priorities and determined which would be the other 3. So for economic development, infrastructure, public space, and safety. So to stimulate the local economy is extremely important. And right now, most of the community don't believe that their food needs are necessary or that their restaurant needs are necessary. So they are also in agreement that there's space for new businesses, and it's good to bring more businesses in as long as parking is provided and facades are renovated. The current conditions, as I talked about, have a lot of potential. Like down here, you see the awnings, and even here, but what's happening is that due to the lack of safety, some measures have to be taken for these businesses. So stimulating that local economy would be easy because there's so many advantages, like the diverse community and the proximity to downtown Tampa, but there's also a lot of challenges. And it's important to continue to support those small businesses and create more pedestrian and vehicular traffic and take care of that crime issue. So this is what the current plan looks like. And the idea is to provide a space that has equity and that people have the possibility to live comfortably in. So the first phase of my proposal starts in this. Let me go back. So this is Howard and this is Main Street, and then there's the smaller street called Yoselina Street, and right now it's used mainly for parking, but I think this is a very interesting space to what could happen by activating the second side of the building, that 4th facade, and starting to create a more public space. So in order to do this in a phased way, I suggest that start it by enclosing one of the sides, and that way reducing traffic on Main Street and allowing people to continue to park here, continue to occupy those spaces, but generating a greater public space here for the Celestines Park and the other businesses. And then starting to increase a little bit the density to bring more of that residential in order to have the people to support those businesses. Reorganizing the parking in order for it to be at its most efficient, and starting to create that secondary public space that I talked about earlier. So thinking of the street as a primary number 1 space, and then the parks as number 2, and then this becomes a number 3, kind of a smaller, more private public space. And as well, continuing to revitalize these parks, to work on the infrastructure of the sidewalks and so on. This would be also keeping the local identity in mind, and something that is very noticeable in West Tampa are these beautiful murals. And I think that's something that could continue to be used, and not only in the big public walls, but also in those smaller alleyways, in order to bring people in and take them to those other spaces and walking through those blocks. So this is that Yoselina Street, and right across the street, you see that even just these simple details are enough to make a place more interesting. The use of trees, and this is a beautiful street already, but imagine it with it being occupied by pedestrians, and that's what we're gonna look like in a minute. And so the second phase of this proposal would be to make the whole Yoselina Street completely pedestrian, and that would create this secondary park. And this is all granted acknowledging the fact that these streets are going to be equally busy and that people are going to be walking, but they can be walking around both sides or in between the blocks. So this is an axonometric view of the current conditions. And again, there's so much empty space and unused space throughout. And this is the first phase, starting to look at the exterior seating, at the use of the alleyways, at the rethinking of the street in order to provide a pedestrian sidewalk and a bike route, as well as on-street parking, trees, and rethinking the lanes. And this is the third, the proposed phase 2, in which I propose having a parking garage in order to redirect the parking and providing those spaces, but also redeveloping those interior areas and adding that architecture with the diversity of uses that I've been talking about. For a community of a variety of housing types, so that there's affordable housing, so that there's senior housing, young people housing, because that mix of people is really key to have a successful place. So these are some of the rendering images of what it could look like. So these are the current conditions. There's parking, all these trees that are not in their best shape. And so for phase 1 would enclose this side of Yoselina Street and start to occupy this whole area by pedestrians. And in phase 2, it looks much more lively. Again, pedestrians occupying the street, creating this secondary space, and having easy access to Main Street, where buildings like this are proposed, where the first level is commercial and then there's residential on top. Here's another image following the same idea. The current conditions, phase 1, and then phase 2. And I think it starts to show how the buildings shape the space in between them, and these become key to the pedestrian use. And I'm going to do the same here in axonometric view with the current conditions, the proposed phase 1, and then proposed phase 2. And having these trees and the greenery, the lighting, the human scale lighting to illuminate not only the street, but the pedestrians as well, and be a visual hint for cars to know that there's pedestrians around. This is a view of Main Street and its current conditions. And here it is in the future of what it could look like. Same in sections. And a view of Yoselina Street as well. Here it is again in axonometric. And so the variety of buildings, I think these are just placeholders right now, because the people in the community did mention that they don't want a building to come in and disrespect or not honor the style and the character of West Tampa. And so that's where the social participation comes in, and they are the ones that get to decide what kind of architecture they want. We simply suggest, what could work, the types of businesses and the types of uses. And that is all for my presentation. Thank you so much.